One of those boomers who elevated freak into a compliment and turned party into a verb.
I was more worried about the mindless stunt he'd pulled in Norton's office because it meant Lenny's manic cycle could be kicking in.
The one on Mother's chest, noun, that taught me scar, raised stripe where a breast had been.
This pitcher was the strikeout king of the league. People weren't supposed to hit home runs off of him, let alone me. I was not necessarily a long ball hitter.
I've come to live in Nebraska 4 different times. I came here as a child. My father was transferred with the railroad to the Havelock shops, and we were here for a while and then went back to Iowa. My first teaching job was at Westside High School in Omaha, and I came back here for graduate school after living again in Iowa. And then in 1998, I left a teaching position in Illinois and came back here, and I think to stay for good. It's had a tremendous influence. I think, like most writers from the center of the continent, whether the Midwest or the Great Plains, I have had to deal with the perception of many people that there's no history here and there's no culture here. And like many writers of place, I've tried to fill in the empty spaces. I've tried to dig into the place, the human and the natural history of it, and find the historical narratives that seem absent here. I don't know if I would be as place-based if I lived in maybe New England or the Southwest. There's something about this erroneous perception that it's empty here that has drawn me as a writer. When I was a high school teacher, I taught To Kill a Mockingbird. I remember my first job, I taught it 6 times a day, and semester after semester, and I had big chunks of that novel memorized. I learned how Harper Lee made a sentence. I even learned how to use a semicolon after reading and teaching that book so many times, semester after semester. I learned something about her humor, her word choice. And it's not that I want to write like Harper Lee, but it was really, it was a great teacher for me to learn one way of writing very well. And years later, when I was trying to write essays, I turned the same close attention to Annie Dillard and really trying to get inside of her sentences, her word choice, her way of thinking, and writing some pretty derivative essays for a while, just flat out imitating her at times. And eventually I broke away from that and found my own voice, but that close attention, sentence level, word level, is where I really learned to write. It wasn't in any classroom, it was just from very, very close reading. I always wanted to be a writer. I wrote a lot as a child. I remember when I was in 5th grade, I wrote a couple of novels that my family moved the following year, and somehow those got thrown out or lost or something, but I always wrote. It wasn't until I was maybe about 30 years old, I was at an event where I had to introduce myself, and I was really astonished at what I said. I introduced myself as a mother and as a writer, and I said, and I have a teaching job to pay the bills. And I did not intend to say any of that, it was just there. And I thought, I now think of myself as a writer. And have done so ever since then. That's a hard thing to do. Many of my students, my graduate writing students, struggle with that, to actually call themselves a writer and to actually say they're writing a book. There's a threshold that's crossed, and once you do, you start reorganizing your life around those things. It's a scary threshold. When I was away from Nebraska, I missed the openness. I moved to a place that had national forest. It was very hilly and rocky. People went rock climbing there. This was in the very southern tip of Illinois. It's a part of the state that a lot of people don't know about, how similar it is to the Ozarks. And I missed the openness of the skies. I missed these little patches of prairie that I like to frequent. I missed the land more than anything. Several things inspire me to write. One is the need to make order out of my experiences. The other is the need to look at things again. Natalie Goldberg said that writers are kind of dumb. They need to live things twice. Once in real life, whatever that is, and then again on paper. And I certainly feel that way, that I don't, to move beyond the surface of experiences, I need to write about them. And spend quite a bit of time writing it and rewriting it and rewriting it. So those are probably the main driving impulses. There's also the desire to communicate to people, to try to change their thinking in some way. Everything I write is about place, and pretty much the two places I call home, Iowa and Nebraska. How people are shaped by a place, how people are impacting the land, those are preoccupations. And home. Home comes out in everything I write. I'm a morning writer. I like to get up early. Ideally, get up 5:30 and 6 and have things out of the way so I can sit down and write. It seems a couple hours of writing time in the morning is equal to several hours in the afternoon or the evening. Quite a bit of writing takes place away from the computer. I walk 3, 4, 5 miles a day and get a lot of writing done during my walking. Try to take paper and pencil because the best ideas come then, or ideas about how to revise something, or just the right word choice, or seeing exactly what I needed to see, and that belongs in an essay. So late afternoon, early evening walks are a good time to write. I think I write for my students. All of my students are trying to be writers, and they read my books, and I guess they're the ideal writer because they always come back with some comment, some question. So that is my number one audience. People that want to write need to read, and they need to write, and they need to make time. All of that sounds very simple and obvious. Everybody I know that writes reads a lot. They read good stuff, they read bad stuff, and they're reading as writers. What is this author doing that I would want to do in my own work, or what is he or she doing that I would never ever do in my own work? Actually taking the time to write, I've spoken to so many people in my lifetime when they find out that I'm a writer and a teacher of writing, who tell me they want to write too, but they're not doing any writing. And I believe that if the muse is going to call, we need to be at the computer or at the notebook or wherever we do the writing. We need to put in the hours as if it's a part-time job, whether you feel like writing or not, whether you're inspired or not. You just need to be there doing it. And the issue of time, the more deeply committed one becomes to writing, the more that becomes an issue, because I remember the days when I would write during my free period, my planning period when I was a high school teacher, and there wasn't much writing that came out of that. And it was because I needed chunks of time where I could have unbroken concentration. And to get that often means changing your life. Something about relationships, something about your job, something about the expectations you and others have for you have to change if there's going to be those chunks of time where you can write. And so that means sacrifice, and that's a hard thing to think about. I gave up a tenure track position so I would have more time to write and live where I wanted to. I don't regret it, but there was an enormous change in finances because of that. That was the sacrifice I made so I could write 4, 5, 6 days a week. Presently, I'm working on a collection of essays. I'm not exactly sure what they're about. I can say that they're about living in the center of the continent, not just southeastern Nebraska like my last book, but looking at the Great Plains and the Midwest. I think the essays are all pointing towards something. I just haven't figured out what it is yet. I wrote an essay about Amelia Earhart's last visit home to Atchison, Kansas. A visit that hasn't gotten much coverage by her biographers, but if you go to Atchison, you find quite a bit of information about it. It's pretty poignant. This was a very important visit to the people there. I've written about a couple of giants who worked for Barnum in the 19th century who settled in Seville, Ohio to become farmers. I just find that whole idea very charming, and wrote their story and what it meant to be considered a freak in the 19th century and how one becomes just regular citizens in town. I've written an essay about hiking in the Luss Hills of western Iowa. I've written a big essay about corn, which if you're writing about the center of the continent seems to be something you need to cover at some point. Just the huge influence corn has had on human history in this part of the world. And I'm just going to keep working in this way, writing nature essays and essays about quirky pieces of history in the Midwest and the Great Plains. And it's a pleasure to be here this evening. I'm going to be reading from The Nature of Home. This is a book that is about home. It tries to define what home is, how home can be found or created, what it means to live without a home, to be homeless, and how home affects the way that we think and feel and act as individuals and as members of communities and societies and nations even. Anything I read from the book will misrepresent it. It's a collection of 22 essays, different in style, different in subject matter. Some are biographical essays, some are autobiographical, some are nature essays, travel essays, meditations, a little bit of polemic even. The essay I've chosen to read first is a combination of nature writing and autobiography. It's an essay that I wrote in response to a request from a student. One of my students asked me to write an essay about my hair, which is always long and always braided. My hair was the last thing I wanted to write about. It seems for the past 30 years I've answered questions about it, like how long does it take to wash and how do you braid it? And then the oddest question of all, how long is it, as if I measure it. So I didn't have any interest in writing an essay about my hair, but I liked the student very much and decided I would just do a free write, a couple pages, send it to her, and be done with it. But as so often happens with writing, one thing leads to another, and before I knew it, I had an essay about my hair, my daughter's hair, the Platte River, water use in Nebraska, Hindu, Hebrew, and Christian theology, and a little bit of aesthetic theory. All of that in 8 pages. And the only way to deal with such diverse subject matter was to braid it, to braid the different strands. This essay is called Braided. A soft braid doesn't hold, an uneven braid doesn't please the eye. A good flat braid is uniform. The rug yarn are bread dough or hairs divided into 3 equal sections. It is firm, with no equivocation, no change in the tension, as one makes one diagonal pass after another, stacking a neat, slightly tilted row of V's. Since I was 21, my hair has been past my waist. If I wear it loose, it catches on doorknobs, buttons, or wristwatches and mats so badly near my neck that I have to cut the snarls. So for the past 2 decades, I've braided my hair first thing in the morning and whenever it becomes loose and wispy during the day. I start the braid in the back of my head, both hands raised and working where I can't see them. After I've made 5 or 6 V's, enough that the braid feels really started, I swing my hair over my left shoulder and braid within a few inches of the end. Done in about 2 minutes. At the top, my braid is almost as thick as my wrist. At the bottom, where it is bound with a coated rubber band, it is the diameter of my thumb. I suppose that from a distance, my braid looks like an utterly supple external spine. I do not remember when I first learned to braid or who, if anyone, taught me. But I remember that when my own hair was too short to braid, my mother insisted that I wear a pixie cut until I was 9. I braided everything else. My doll's yellow yarn hair, the fringe on chenille bedspreads or woolen scarves, slick stems of white clover, Christmas tree tinsel, twisted threads of drapery tassels. Perhaps I was drawn to braiding because it produces a whole that is stronger than the sum of its parts, or perhaps because a braid is more than it appears to be, 2 crisscross strands. Driven by rain and snowstorms in the Rocky Mountains, the turbulent, sediment-laden waters of the North and South Platte Rivers flow toward the adjacent high plains of Wyoming, Colorado, and western Nebraska. The North and South Plattes meet in a dramatic moment in the city of North Platte, Nebraska, in a spot uncommemorated by either a plaque or a park, and continue as a single body toward the Missouri River, a total journey of 900 miles. Like almost every other river on the Great Plains, the Plattes flow east, a liquid link between the Rockies and the Midwest. An astronaut's view of the region reveals that the North and South Platte rivers are the extended arms of a great wavy Y, of which the Platte River is the stem. But I think of the Platte as a spinal column, arching, rounding, straightening across the entire 450-mile width of Nebraska. The eastern quarter of the Platte, from its confluence with the Loup to its confluence with the Missouri, is one wide flowing stream, like the Mississippi, the Des Moines, the Missouri, and other rivers I have known. But from the confluence of the 2 branches at North Platte to Grand Island, the river winds through tree-lined, creek-like channels. Because of these several shifting channels that intersect and part again and again, the Central Platte is referred to as braided. The development of the braid is fairly simple. Because the land has a low, steady gradient, and because the river lacks the volume to flush out the silt, a midstream bar of sediment forms. This obstruction parts the water, more deposition occurs, and many sandbars form, dividing the river into even smaller channels. An aerial view of the Central Platte shows that the erratic parting, looping, and reuniting of the streams, the disappearing islands, the shifting shorelines, the channels leading nowhere, create a braid that is neither firm nor even in its weaving of light-filled water and land, but a wild, vascular snarl. Other than myself, only 3 people have braided my hair. One, a beautician whom I paid for a trim, asked if she could French braid it just to see how it looked, no charge. She began with 3 clumps of hair near my crown. As she plaited, she picked up strands of hair along the sides, not only vertically stacking the tilted V's, but basting V's along each side of the braid through the continual additions of hair. When she was no longer working near my scalp, she worked in a plain, flat braid. Her creation was beautiful, but I was afraid that the interlacing wouldn't come out. After I left the beauty shop, I spent a panic-filled 10 minutes unplaiting. When I was in my early 20s, I tended bar in a smoky tavern. So that my hair would not absorb as much of the stink of the cigarette smoke and would stay firm through an 8 or 10-hour shift, my mother braided it so tightly that I couldn't drop my eyebrows. When I combed out my hair after work, it fell in yellow ripples like those of the angels and Madonnas in 15th century Flemish paintings, the closest thing to curls that my hair has ever known. Now my mother says that whenever she can't sleep, which is often, she imagines an endless length of hair, that she braids tightly and evenly, what was outside moving inside, what was inside moving outside, until she drops her work and sleeps. While we're standing in line at the grocery store or library, my daughter Meredith removes the coated rubber band and unravels my hair almost to the top of my braid. Then she rebraids it all the way to the tip, and so loosely that she can wiggle a few fingers between the V's. It looks longer that way, she says, and it does, and touches the tops of my thighs. I imagine that when I'm old, forgetful, and too stiff to reach behind my head, Meredith will braid my hair into a long white queue. At the top, the diameter of my thumb. At the bottom, the diameter of a pencil. A trinity is a braid of sorts, binding 3 parts into an indivisible whole. The ancient Hindus conceived of the deity as having one body with 3 heads, each facing in a different direction. Vishnu, the preserver, appears on the right, Shiva, the destroyer, on the left, Brahma, the creator, in the middle. Each aspect of this triune God plays an essential role in the cycle of life and the workings of the universe. Each aspect is indispensable. The ancient Hebrews also may have conceived of God as a plurality, perhaps even a trinity. Elohim, the frequently used name for God in the Hebrew scriptures, is the plural form of Eloah. In some passages, the verb that follows Elohim is plural, but more often it is singular. Thus, some say that rather than referring to the plurality of God, Elohim is an intensive plural, used to denote God's greatness and majesty. Others, however, argue that a plural noun is a plural noun no matter what follows it, and so it denotes more than one. When 3 visitors, men in some translations, angels in others, appeared at Abraham's tent to announce that within the next year Sarah would bear the son that she and Abraham were long past even hoping for, Abraham bowed before them and called them Elohim, the great majestic God that is at once singular and plural. Many centuries later, the Christian doctrine of the Trinity was developed as a rebuttal to Arius, the heretic priest of Alexandria, Egypt, who believed that while Jesus was a superior being, he was not equal to God. The Nicene Council of 325 said that God who sends Jesus and Jesus who sends the Holy Spirit are one. God is 3 persons in one nature. And the Trinitarian symbol refers to the 3 ways in which the one God is humanly known, as creator, as transformer, as inner spirit. Many thinking contemporary Christians find this doctrine of the deity's plurality to be overly abstract, patriarchal, largely extra-biblical, and just downright uninspiring. Mostly we ignore it. Yet once I liberate this old symbol from the mass of dogmas that have developed over the centuries and reconceive it in terms of my experiences with God, it is meaningful. For instance, Trinitarian theology teaches me that the God I live with and love is not a flat cut-out figure, nor is the deity an unknowable abstraction. Rather, God is 3-dimensional and a someone rather than a something. And this God is one of relationships, Mother, Father, God in the sky, Daughter, Son, God of the earth, all-encompassing, transforming, genderless spirit, not 3 separate centers of consciousness and will, but one great spirit that exists through the relationships of the parts, just as I exist only through the boundedness of my 3 parts, spirit, body, mind. Meditating on this koan that is the Trinity teaches me that when I focus on the parts, I perceive the grass flower instead of the prairie, the historical event instead of the historical pattern, the individual notes instead of the melody. By surrendering control over the process of seeing, I see more. Try it. When you blur the eye and allow all of the parts to exist at once, you behold the landscape, the meaning of the story, the essence of the other, something of God's depth and breadth. Be there as long as you can. Prior to the construction of a series of dams and reservoirs, the Central Platte flooded each spring in response to melting snowpack in the Rockies, the greatest part of the river's annual discharge. During the spring, the Central Platte was more than a mile wide. During the rest of the year, the river might just be a thin trickle, or it might dry up altogether. Paul J. Currier, Deputy Director of the Platte River Hooping Crane Maintenance Trust, reports that since the turn of the century, flood flows and mean annual flows have declined more than 70%. Likewise, channel widths have declined 50 to 90%. Where does the water go? In 1990, 1 million acres in Nebraska were irrigated through surface water, 7 million by groundwater. Most of the surface water was drawn from the Platte and its tributaries. The river has also been manipulated for flood control, power generation, and the growing urban centers that demand water for showers, dishwashers, washing machines, green lawns, and golf courses. In short, eastern Nebraskans use an average of 200 gallons of water per capita per day. Nebraskans from the semi-arid western half of the state use more than double that amount. One effect of the reduced flow and speed of the river is that it can no longer scour the floodplains, banks, and sandbars clean of the cottonwoods, willows, alders, and Russian olives that germinate in the wet soil. Without the discipline imposed by annual floodwaters, the river appears to be a creek threading its way through dense floodplain forest. While some native species, wild turkeys and white-tailed deer, for instance, have benefited from the increased vegetation, most have not. The Big Bend, the 80-mile stretch between Overton and Grand Island, the tightly corseted waste on the hourglass that is the Central Flyway, host millions of migrating birds, including 7 to 9 million waterfowl, 1/2 million sandhill cranes, 5 endangered species, whooping cranes, least terns, piping plovers, Eskimo curlews, peregrine falcons, as well as bald eagles who were recently removed from the endangered species list. Late each winter, these and many other avian species leave their winter feeding grounds in Texas, New Mexico, and Mexico. Sandhill cranes, for instance, stop along the Platte for several weeks to rest, fatten up, perform their courtship rituals, and mate before continuing their journey to their summer nesting grounds in the Arctic. They prefer broad channels and shallow water because there they are protected from such nighttime predators as coyotes, dogs, and foxes, and not so long ago, wolves and cougars. They prefer wet meadows to wet woodlands because of the greater food supply. If the river becomes too loosely braided, more land than water, more trees than light, the birds will go elsewhere, though I don't know where that might be. When Meredith was 3, she twisted her doll's hair into a coil. She called it braiding. But the moment she released her hold, the cord sprang loose. "Teach me to braid," she said. We combed the doll's hair, then divided it into 3 equal sections. I showed her the simple over and over and over motion, but she could not duplicate it. Instead, she wanted to pull strands under as well as over, creating a more complicated, nay, impossible design. When the rather cross-stitched pattern did not emerge, she gave up. Now Meredith is 9. She says that her hair is brown, black, red, gold, every color. The texture is somewhere between the thick, kinked strands of her father's Negroid hair and the thin, straight strands of my Caucasian hair. She likes to wear her hair, which has never been cut, free, only held by a headband or pulled into a high ponytail so that her curls form a billowing crown of glory. But since she does not like having her hair combed, she only has 2 choices, very short and natural, or always braided. Before I begin braiding Meredith's hair, I oil her scalp with Blue Magic Bergamot hair and scalp conditioner and work a wide-toothed comb through snarls that make us both scream. Then I draw clean parts and begin braiding, my hands slick with the blue grease. While tight braids make my hair look shorter, they work against Meredith's curls, creating a longer look. Conversely, by braiding her hair loosely, I can create a shorter, thicker look, since a softer braid permits the curl. Finally, I decorate her braids with bright pairs of interlocking plastic beads. Sometimes Meredith's father's wife or his sister braids her hair. Then cornrows radiate from Meredith's crown, or liana-like braids frame her face, or braids coiled like snails or bobby-pinned in the center of neat squares, or braids swirl and rise into a cluster of beads and spill out like water from a fountain. When a former neighbor of mine, a black man with the same birthday as the writer Richard Wright and me, saw one of these intricate, imaginative creations that my daughter was wearing, he said to me, "You've learned to braid." Ephemeral objects of beauty, an ice carving chiseled in finest detail, a room aglow with the light of scores of candles, a celebration cake piled with sugary roses, bows, and scalloped moldings, are shot through with preciousness and urgency, qualities lacking in more durable works of art, say animal-shaped bronze bells from the Shang dynasty, a Michelangelo fresco, a Georgia O'Keeffe painting. The artist who worked 36 braids and hundreds of beads into my daughter's hair was not seeking to leave a lasting testimony to her skills. Rather, she brought forth an extravagant yet functional beauty to be savored now or tomorrow because next week would be too late. Meredith tries to preserve her stepmother's or aunt's short-lived works of art as long as possible by wearing a pair of pink tights that she has outgrown over her braids, the legs tied in a rose-like knot above her forehead when she sleeps. But when she only has 1, 2, or 3 braids, one of her or my simple creations, she skips the pink cap and replaits her hair in the morning. As I watch her hands, I'm delightfully confused. It is my mother's hands, my daughter's hands, fluidly, automatically, pulling the hair over and over and over. Mother, daughter, heavenly parent, earthly child, boundless permeating spirit, meandering channels, dividing and joining, water, land, and light. One blessed Trinity flowing into the next. What I'd like to read next are what I call lexicon entries. Between each of the 22 essays in the nature of home are very short little writings. Some are just a paragraph, some are just a page. And each of these are about a word that I feel in some way is connected to my concept of home. Some of the words are real obvious. You'll see that right away. Some words are not. You'd have to read the essay on either side to figure out how they tie in. The lexicon entries, I should give credit for where I got this idea. Kathleen Norris in Dakota has sprinkled weather reports throughout the book, and I really love those. I actually love those, I think, more than the essays. And then Stephen Dunn has a collection of what he calls prose pieces that are called riffs and reciprocities. And these are pairs of words, and he's written just a paragraph on each one. And he's written the paragraphs so that they talk to each other. You understand the other word by reading what he wrote about the other one, if that makes sense. And I really loved that idea of suggesting a third. There's a pair, but the way they talk to each other, you feel the presence of something else. And so I created these lexicon entries to set up reverberations between the essays on either side of them. If an essay was finished, but I wasn't finished with the subject matter, I could carry on even farther. I could contradict myself. I could be more didactic, more suggestive than I'd been in an essay, whatever. It was a wonderfully liberating device. Each lexicon entry contains a definition from the Oxford English Dictionary, which I used right here at Bennett Martin Public Library. And then it contains my own definition, my own sometimes idiosyncratic definition. So I'll read a handful of these. And I did include etymologies in these, and since I'm not sure how to pronounce words that are Sanskrit or Old Prussian or Gothic, I will skip those. The first lexicon entry is nostalgia. European medical men first diagnosed homesickness in the 17th century among Swiss peasants who hired out as soldiers in foreign countries. For some of these mercenaries, homesickness was a fatal condition. In his 1688 medical treatise, Dissertatio de Nostalgia oder Heimweh, the Swiss physician Johannes Hofer called this body and soul sickening longing for home nostalgia. Nastos meaning homeward journey, algos meaning pain or sorrow in Greek. Nostalgia is a longing to go back to homeland, hometown, house, hearth, family. In short, to wax nostalgic is to yearn to return to that faraway, long ago place-time that is home. For me, the curiosity is not that some soldiers, immigrants, refugees, nursing home residents, and first-year college students suffer from the insomnia, absent-mindedness, loss of appetite, melancholy, and general wasting away associated with extreme homesickness or home withdrawal, but that some do not. Home. The Germanic words for home may have been derived from two Indo-European words, kai, which means lying or settling down, a bed or couch, as well as something beloved, and kasimus, which means safe dwelling. These linguistic ancestors also yield the Greek kaimen, to put to sleep, which is the root of kaimaterion, a sleeping place or cemetery. In time, the word for home in several European languages also came to mean a village, town, or collection of dwellings. Home is both a community and a safe, beloved place to lay down your living or dead body for the night or for eternity. Now we use the word home to refer to one's fixed residence, the center of domestic life and interest, as well as the center of the neighborhood, city or town, state, and region to which one properly belongs, in which one's affections center, in which one finds refuge or rest. But in the past several decades in the United States, Australia, and increasingly elsewhere, home has also come to designate a building that is a place of private residence. According to the real estate industry's limited and desacralized definition of the word, home is just a physical structure, one's mailing address, for the time being. This makes light of the fact that some of the despair felt by people living in refugee camps or homeless shelters is that they are not homeless. They know where home is or was or should be. They know it as the place where they would most prefer to lay their bodies down, the place they dream of when they sleep, a place and circumstance that can't be bought or sold, that persist even when taken from them by bombs, tanks, tornadoes, wrecking balls, or eviction notices. Citizen. Once the people of the United States were referred to as citizens, from the Latin civitatis, a city-state. A citizen was a member of a state or nation, especially one with a republican form of government, who owed allegiance to it by birth or naturalization and was entitled to full civil rights. Not so long ago, the media, economists, politicians, and others who comprise the powerful, impersonal they, to whom we so frequently refer, began speaking of the American people as consumers instead of citizens. Being a consumer is good, we are told, because consumerism, a progressively greater and greater consumption of material goods, is the heart and soul of the American economic system, the very foundation of our freedom. This new label reflected or initiated a forfeiting of responsibilities. While a citizen would question how to balance wants and resources, after all, to consume is to destroy something else, a consumer would not. While a citizen is charged with a sense of mutual responsibilities, civic and political duties in exchange for civic and political privileges and protections, a consumer is not. In a nation where most people aspire to be greater and greater consumers, to be little more than one's preoccupation with the getting of things is considered fruitless or aberrant only by the radical fringe, those who are consumed by a passion for self-reliance, deep community, God, or the life of the mind. Body. The Germanic tribes that settled in England 15 to 16 centuries ago had various names for the body: Bodig, Fjerdbold, Fjerdhus, Fleshama, Likama, but their most provocative name is also a metaphor: Banhaus, bone house. And by extension, the mind is personified in the Old English narrative of the biblical Exodus as Banhaus's Beard, the guardian of the bone house. Obvious physical similarities exist between a house and a body. The skeleton of a body corresponds to the frame of a house, bodily cavities to rooms, the various bodily orifices to windows, doors, chimneys, and other points of ingress and egress. To enter a body or house without the owner's permission is an act of aggression, a violation of private inner space. Yet this metaphor breaks down rather quickly. A house is a shell or container that becomes inhabitable space when one adds furniture and a source of heat and light. Bodies, however, arrive as inhabited space, possessing all or most of the essentials, even if small, undeveloped, or defective. While the shape of the houses we inhabit influences how we perceive space, the shape of the body determines how we perceive everything. The body is, in Annie Berthoff's words, our primordial speculative instrument, as well as the source of the images by which we represent our recognitions. Try to imagine how an earthworm, spider, crane, or cow perceives the world based purely on the number, position, or lack of limbs or eyes. Yet people have long conceived of the body as the temporary and earthly abode of the soul or mind. Plato wrote that the body is the prison of the soul. The unknown author of 2 Peter conceives of his body as a shelter or outer covering. I think it right, as long as I am in this body, tent in the Greek, to arouse you by way of reminder, since I know that putting off my body, or tent, will be soon. At the turn of the millennium, we are as convinced of the split between body and mind as were the ancient Greeks, the early Christians, the old Anglo-Saxons. When we fail to meet our own expectations, we say that our spirit is willing but our flesh is weak. When we encounter hard times, we say that it takes everything we've got to keep body and soul together. Post-human artists, extreme body-mind dichotomists, believe that through technology, they can transcend the wet sack that is the body. Sterlach, an Australian performance artist, had wires inserted into his limbs and organs by which his audience could manipulate his body via the internet and then watch his responses. Ping Body is what he calls this piece of work. His other works include Evolving URL, Body, Metabody, and Extra Ear. Sterlach says that through his art, the body becomes hollow with no meaningful distinctions between public, private, and physiological spaces. One no longer looks at art nor performs as art, but contains art. The hollow body becomes a host, not for a self or a soul, but simply for a sculpture. Even people who know better have a hard time letting go of the body-mind dichotomy. Candace Pert, the biochemist who discovered opiate receptors and other peptides that are the biochemical units of emotions, says that the peptides and their receptors float around on the surface of the cells. Yet she confesses that it took her 15 years before she could believe the deep story in her research, that mind is not just in the brain, but part of a communications network throughout the brain and body. In other words, mind, emotion, and body are in every cell. The body is at once the guest and the host, the dweller and the dwelling place. Niche. To the ecologist, a niche, from nidus, Latin for nest, is not just the passive receptacle into which eggs are laid and the young sheltered, but a statement of dynamic relationship. In Animal Ecology, Charles Elton wrote that the word niche is used to describe the status of an animal in its community, to indicate what it is doing and not merely what it looks like. Habitat is an organism's address. Niche is its profession, the job it performs in the ecological system. Figuratively speaking, a niche is a place or position adapted to the character or capabilities or suited to the merits of a person or thing. Sometimes one finds her niche ready and waiting. Sometimes she must carve it out for herself. What is lacking in this dictionary definition is the mutual adaptation stressed by the ecological definition. If one is to live harmoniously, she must not only consider if the alcove she enters is tall, deep, and wide enough, but if she will complement the contents of other niches and how she stands in respect to the main events: feasting, dancing, governing, worshiping, passing to and fro. Sojourner. At the heart of the old Frisian sojourner is the word journey. The lower late Latin root of this word is diurnation, a day's travel or work. Generally, a journey refers to prolonged traveling. Thus, a sojourner is one who resides for a while in a place that is not her home, among a people who see her as neither native nor alien. A sojourner is someone trying to go home again, or trying to find a place and people that could become home. In the Hebrew Scriptures, a sojourner is one who lives in mutually responsible association with a community that is not one's own, trading faithfulness, obedience, and labor for protection and sustenance. The sojourner's status and privileges aren't due to kinship and birthplace, but to the bond of hospitality between host and guest. The stranger who sojourns among you was exempt from the ban on eating the flesh of animals who died natural deaths, yet could participate in the assembly, was entitled to equal justice, and was required to celebrate the Sabbath, keep laws, observe festivals, and so on. Sojourners gathered wood and drew water for the Israelites. In a literal sense, all humans were or are sojourners, since human history is essentially a travel narrative. The migration of one's people from that earliest home in East Africa or the Eden of the imagination to the other side of the river, ocean, plain, or mountain. In the Hebrew Scriptures, all of us are sojourners, just passing through, never completely at home on the earth or in our bodies. God is our good host who provides protection and companionship. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Hold not thy peace at my tears, for I am thy passing guest, a sojourner like all my fathers. We are to be good guests, helping with the supper dishes, not taking too long in the bathroom, accepting that our ways may not be the ways of our host, never completely unpacking our bags. Hearth. The Anglo-Saxon word hearth and what it denotes has changed little in the past couple of millennia. Then and now it refers to a brick, stone, or tiled floor of a fireplace, often extending out into the room. Metaphorically, the hearth refers to the fireside as the center of home and family life. What strikes me about the word hearth is that it contains within it two other Anglo-Saxon words, heart and earth. Though of different etymological roots, these words feel linked to me. In fact, if you circle each word within the word hearth, your circles will interlock. Earthen, heart-filled hearth, humankind's first altar. Instead of building and tending a fire that transforms oxygen and wood into the heat and light that warms bodies, that converts hard, raw, cold food into something more palatable, that keeps away the terrors of the encroaching night, I perform work for other people that provides the money, that buys the gas, that fuels the motor in the furnace in a corner of my basement. This is the hearth that I keep. Though my house is too tiny and my income too small, I dream of buying a wood-burning stove or of hiring someone to build a fireplace. Last winter, to take the edge off my heating bill, I bought a white Westinghouse electric space heater at Kmart. When the 9 heating coils become radiant glowing orange and the fan blows out the heat, my children and I gather around it. Neighbor. The Old English negabur is formed by compounding ne, meaning nigh or near, and gabur, a dweller. Quite simply, a neighbor is one who dwells near you. But what is near? In Home from Nowhere, James Howard Kunstler defines a neighborhood as a 5-minute walking distance, or quarter mile, from the edge to the center, and thus a 10-minute walk edge to edge, or 1/2 square mile. Kunstler's definition is too expansive for old Mrs. Vasek, who lives 2 doors down from me. If she steps into her front yard, she has ventured far. Kunstler's definition is too narrow for me. I set out from my house each day for a 3 to 6 mile walk, heading in whichever direction exerts the strongest pull that day. This is my neighborhood. But is everyone I meet on my city rambles my neighbor? When the testy lawyer asked Jesus a similar question, Jesus answered with the story of the Samaritan who stopped to help a man of unidentified race, rank, and religion who had been robbed, beaten, and left for dead at the side of the road, a man ignored by a priest and a Levite also passing that way. Since the lawyer knew that he was required by Mosaic law to love his neighbor as much as himself, he probably hoped that this teacher would offer a purely geographical definition. How much easier to love people whom we barely know. Perhaps the lawyer and his near neighbors comfortably avoided the depths by only speaking of weather, garbage service, pets, grass, and gutters. But that seems so much like us than it is to love those others, the sojourners, the exiles, those left for dead on the side of the road, those on the other side of the ideological fence. While Jesus did not offer an easy, terse bumper sticker definition, support your neighbor, buy American, he did offer a geographical definition of sorts. If a neighbor is anyone who extends mercy and loving kindness to us, if a neighbor is anyone to whom we could extend mercy and loving kindness, then every person in the parable, the half-dead victim, the oppressed Samaritan, the Samaritan's oppressors, is a neighbor. Therefore, if no one is too far from our home territory, too like or unlike ourselves to be considered our neighbor, then home, the point from which we determine all distances, is everywhere too. Relic. On a high shelf above the stove, I keep a small wooden box that once belonged to my maternal grandmother, May Paris, the last relative of her generation. This box came to me not after she died on July 11th, 2000, but after she broke up housekeeping and entered a nursing home, the only time I ever saw her cry. The wood is the color of cedar, though it doesn't smell like cedar. On the top front of the box, recipes is written in green cursive with a cluster of green leaves at both ends of the word. On the bottom front of the box lid are red and yellow apples and a red and yellow pear. Inside the lid is a Bisquick recipe cut from a magazine for easy drop Danish cookies. In the front interior of the box are recipes cut from newspapers and magazines for hominy casserole, lightning fudge, cottage cheese dressing, create a crust apple custard pie, and easy cheesy turkey loaf. Behind the clippings are perhaps 150 index cards, about half of which contain recipes written in Granny's own hand. She wrote legibly and rarely misspelled a word, commendable for a woman who did not go to high school. As I read the cards, I discover a charming quirk. My Granny's words start on the line but slant upward as if moved by the slightest impulse to be airborne. When a T appears as the final letter in a word, the tail swings up and back as if to cross the T, but stops short of this goal and arcs outward instead, another suggestion of flight. I do not remember eating many of the foods for which these cards provide instructions. Ham jambalaya, cart burgers, egg noodles, Ozark venison stew, caramel dumplings, grape wine with a balloon, sauerbraten rabbit, bran and cheddar cheese batter bread. But the cards remind me that Granny loved anything that included cornmeal. 3 recipes for cornbread, 2 for cornbread dressing, 1 each for cornmeal dumplings, corn dogs, and hush puppies, and anything escalloped, cabbage, corn, apples, oysters, moist fruity cakes, numerous batter-spattered edge-worn recipes for apple or peach cakes, and rhubarb pie, 2 recipes, both for a cream filling. This keepsake, this surviving fragment, this movable shrine, this relic, is a fitting reminder of what I knew about my Granny. In her letters to me, I saw her handwriting become looser, more prone to spelling errors, and flight as she aged, and that about which I knew little, the hearty noon meals that she cooked for herself and my grandfather after they both retired. This recipe box reminds me why the ancient Greeks trekked to those temples, claiming to possess Orpheus's lyre, Helen's sandals, or the stone that Kronos swallowed. Why medieval Christians sought those shrines, claiming to possess John the Baptist's jawbone, Jesus' foreskin, threads from Mary's tunic, or a piece of the true cross. Why Bob Marley devotees trek to 56 Hope Road in Kingston, Jamaica, where they can see Marley's herb garden, his blender, his rusted bicycle. Pilgrims know that the part is equivalent to the whole, that through a relic, the saint, prophet, martyr, hero, or loved one lives. A single recipe card, say for ironworker bean soup, evokes a kitchen where my grandfather is sitting at the table, reorganizing his tackle box, a lost reliquary, and my grandmother's at the counter chopping onions, parsley, garlic, and celery, tops and all, the card said, to add to the white beans, ham bone, mashed potatoes, ketchup, and water simmering on the stove. Homewell. When I returned to my growing up place for a visit from whatever faraway place I was living at the time, my granny and my great aunt Percy would each say, "I've sure been homesick for you." This struck me as a moving though odd use of the word homesick. To be homesick is to yearn for certain people, but always within the context of a place and often a time. I guess that these two sisters believed that no matter where they were, if one piece of their image of their belonging place was missing, then they weren't completely at home. Homesick wasn't the right word for that feeling, though I know of no word in our lexicon that is. Perhaps home scattered or home torn could have named what these two women felt so sharply. Nor is there a word in the lexicon that names the state when all of the essential pieces of home are together. But today, January 23rd, 2001, I have brought forth the word that my great aunt and granny needed and am introducing it into general currency. Homewell is not only pronounceable and spellable, but it is a compound word whose meaning is decipherable at first glance, at first hearing. Yet the longer you abide with the word homewell, the more the meaning unfolds. The Anglo-Saxon word home is that place where we lay our bodies down, and our individual abode within a community. The Anglo-Saxon well means agreeable or suitable to one's wish or will. Now, it not only means suitable or proper, but good health, I feel well today, or favored, she is quite well off. The Anglo-Saxon verb wellen or wylen means to bubble up, to flow, spring, or gush from or forth. The Anglo-Saxon noun wella or well is a deep hole or shaft sunk into the earth in order to tap an underground supply of water. Metaphorically, it refers to the source of an abundant supply. When you are homewell, you feel rooted, nurtured, aligned, synchronized, whole, plugged in, and flowing. When you have homewell, what is essential, hearth, home, love, community, belonging, memory, creativity, is with you. Now that we are all here, my granny and my great aunt meant to say, we are homewell. Thank you.